Hello, psychology. Welcome to the study of therapy. Therapy is defined as any treatment designed to make people feel better and function more effectively. Well, in the study of psychology, when we talk about therapy, we basically are talking about two types of therapies. We'll talk about psychotherapy, which is a talk therapy that's designed to help people process through their problems, to talk about difficulties they're having. And when we talk about psychotherapy, you have two types: insight therapy and action therapy. For insight therapies, these are designed with the end goal of giving a person the ability to think about their problem differently. That's seen as the big end goal. The person needs to think about themselves or the situation or the problem differently. Action therapies, however, are focused specifically on the problem, giving a person information and an education necessary to take action steps to solve a problem. The goals of psychotherapy are really determined either solely by the client. In some cases, goals are determined with the help of a directive therapist. So if the client is determining the goal, then we'd say it's a non-directive therapy. If the therapist is determining the goal in the action step, then it is very directive. The other type of therapy that we need to look at is biomedical therapy. Examples of this would be drug therapy, or what we call psychopharmacology. All right, psychopharmacology, I'll have the spelling of that in this video later on. There are some psychosurgeries, which are aimed at actually going into the brain. And then you also have electroshock therapy, ECT, also known as electroconvulsive therapy. So we're going to spend the bulk of our time today talking about psychotherapy. My background is as a trained psychotherapist, and I'm in education now, but have that experience and that training. But also in terms of drug therapy, that will be the second biggest section of this lecture, as we talk about psychopharmacology and how psychotherapy and psychopharmacology are used together. In the early days of treatment, if you were experiencing psychological problems in the 1500s, 1600s, in extreme cases, you would be locked in an insane asylum. Here's a painting of Felipe Pinel. Felipe Pinel is credited with the moral treatment or humane treatment of those with psychological problems. He's the first person to use the word mental illness, the first one to refer to those with mental health problems as patients. Before Felipe Pinel, the treatment of those with psychological difficulty was extremely harsh. Here you have in this painting is very accurate portrayals. Individuals would be chained. Treatments could include bloodletting, bleeding people, letting them bleed. The idea is that this would reset the four humors within their body. They would sometimes be subjected to ice baths, which was basically submerging them in freezing cold water, and sometimes physical punishment. And if a person didn't have psychological problems before they went into an asylum, they often could have problems because of the treatment. I use that word loosely. So Felipe Pinel was a psychiatrist who demanded the humane treatment of mentally ill individuals in France. Sigmund Freud was a key player in the development of psychotherapy. If you recall from our discussion, personality, he based psychoanalysis on his theory of personality. So the psychoanalysis is his form of talk therapy that was really based on his psychodynamic theory. This idea that within your psyche, you have this, in your subconscious mind, you have repressed conflicts. And the treatment for this is to get a person to talk through free association. So free association would be his primary technique for psychoanalysis, which is just a therapy that reveals these unconscious conflicts within the id, ego, and superego. And in free association, the patient would simply talk about everything that comes to mind without fear of criticism, without fear of being chastised. However, you would be analyzed. That's part of the game plan. And something that is inherent in psychoanalysis is the idea that the therapist can know you better than you know yourself. This idea that your mind is divided into conscious and unconscious, with the unconscious being the far greater portion, up to 70% of who you really are, is not knowable without the help of a psychoanalyst like Freud. Freud would use dream interpretation. He would have the patient give detailed accounts of their dreams, and they would come into to therapy, lay down on the couch, and begin just talking about their dream, and then go wherever their mind would take them. It was really kind of a rambling, meandering, and Freud would break down the dreams. Manifest content would be the content of the dream, the who, what, when, and where of the dream, no matter how bizarre it may be. Now, the why of the dream. Why are you dreaming about these kind of bizarre things? He referred to this as the latent content, the symbolic meaning, and he was directly responsible for analyzing the dream. Modern day therapeutic approaches have put the emphasis for dream interpretation on the client. What do you think this means? You're the expert on your life. You're the expert on dreams. So Freud did not have that bias. He worked from the position that he was the expert on analyzing the subconscious mind. Some terms that you will hear therapists discuss even today come directly from Freud. Resistance. If a patient is, or a client is resisting talking about a certain topic, Freud would say this is the topic. It creates some kind of subconscious vulnerability, some ego defense mechanism, and so they resist. Transference comes in when the patient or client projects feelings for important others onto the therapist. So for instance, if there was a rebellion that the adolescent experienced, that they started just really disliking their father, this would oftentimes be attributed to any kind of difficulty in the relationship. If the therapist got on the client's nerves, if the patient became aggravated at the therapist, well then Freud would say that they're just transferring the subconscious anger they held towards their father onto me because I am in an authority position. Now, psychoanalysis today, as all therapeutic models, has reduced some of the authority dynamic, some of the power dynamic, just inherent. Do you see here, this is a man sitting in, man sitting in a chair. He's the analyst. A woman laying down on a couch. She is the patient. And this is a typical setup for psychoanalysis. So it is not, I guess, as politically correct today. The therapist is sitting across from the client, who is sitting up. Oftentimes, patients are not referred to as patients unless it's a psychiatrist in a psychiatric environment. If it's a psychotherapy environment, both will be sitting usually in kind of a relaxed living room type feel. And there's been great effort to try to equalize this relationship, sort of a professional friendship, a professional therapeutic friendship. Today, psychodynamic therapy is a newer term, and the emphasis is on the dynamics within the psyche as opposed to analysis, which again was very authoritarian in nature. So today's therapeutic models are far more non-directive. So the therapist is the neutral, non-judgmental listener who is oftentimes just helping as the client determines what their goals are. Earlier approaches were far more directive. The psychoanalyst is interpreting the client's statements directly. And it was almost like, you can't really know who you are. I can help you figure this out. And along comes a big game changer. This was Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy. It was based on his humanistic personality ideas of the real self versus the ideal self. If you remember from our discussion in an earlier archive, the real self is who I think I am. The ideal self is who I think I should be. And oftentimes conditions of worth set upon me by my parents really give me great anxiety because I can't ever measure up to who I think I should be. And the way Carl Rogers really came to be known is through his psychotherapy and his theory of psychotherapy. So his idea is that therapists can really do great harm if they are an extension of the parents. So if they are giving conditions of worth, he believed therapists should give unconditional positive regard. Here, the therapist is very non-directive. The therapist here will not talk a lot. The therapist will simply listen. The therapist gives nonverbal supportive cues to give the person freedom to talk. And this is an insight therapy. The idea here is that the person will figure out the solution to their problem, and they will do it by themselves with just a little assistance. Rogers believed that the therapist should be reflective. They should simply just mirror back what the individual is talking about, what they're feeling. They should be authentic and transparent. They should have great empathy. Empathy is different than sympathy because empathy is a feeling for you, not feeling sorry for you, right? I'm going to feel with you. And really important here is unconditional positive regard, the idea that I'm going to accept you no matter what you say. So moving to another humanistic therapy, another insight therapy is Gestalt therapy. This was founded by Fritz Perls. Here, the client accepts all of their self, even the parts of them that are not pleasant, such as anger and resentment. He would oftentimes use role-playing, leading questions, and confrontation. So he was very directive, which is unlike a lot of humanistic talk therapies. But Gestalt therapy, its emphasis is on you accepting all of you, even the parts such as resentment, anger. And so sometimes Fritz Perls in therapy would lead patients to become very boisterous in their anger, maybe even yelling and sort of really working through whatever it is they may be feeling. So the evaluation of humanistic therapies, you could say that they have a broad application. We can use talk therapy in marriage and family counseling, career counseling, workplace. But usually the humanistic therapies work best for people who are very verbal, People who are very talkative, people who can have great insight into their own issues, their own problems. So in terms of behavior therapies, we're going to move here to more action therapy. So behaviorists are action oriented. If you remember from our discussion of personality, the behaviorist's version of personality is, your personality is simply the habits that you have developed. What happens if you've got bad habits? Well, the problem here is that the behaviorists don't want to find out how the problem developed. That's not really the emphasis. The emphasis is not developing insight. It's not discussing about difficulty with my parents interacting growing up. What we're interested in is what is going on, what's going wrong. So a lot of the problems that we might treat with behavioral therapy would be phobias, fear of heights, fear of snakes, fear of enclosed spaces. These are just examples. We could treat post-traumatic stress. What kind of things are triggering a post-traumatic panic attack? And so in order to affect change, behavioral therapies are action therapies, and they're focused on the behavior, not the causes. They will use classical and operant conditioning, and they're essentially using behavioral modification or applied behavioral analysis. Now, these words may not mean anything to you at this point, but when we look at applied behavioral analysis, we're talking about something called shaping. And we're essentially building behaviors. So working to the end goal of improving behavior, let's say it's a person's got a fear of heights. Well, we're not just going to bring them to the top of the Empire State Building, right, or the Sears Tower in Chicago. What we may do is do this gradually, bring them gradually, and to reinforce their steps. Now, there are some behavioral treatments that try to flood an individual with whatever it is they're scared of. We'll talk about those in a second. But one really popular type of action therapy, behavioral therapy, is systematic desensitization. The basis of this is treating phobias gradually and desensitizing them to their fear. You could say it involves 3 steps. So the first, we teach someone how to relax. Do this through diaphragmatic breathing, breathing in through the belly and then relaxing. And I will teach my students in class to do this. So I typically ask them to take a deep breath in for 3 seconds and to hold this for 3 seconds and to exhale. And if you've done this, you probably experience something of just a relaxation, kind of a warmth right up here, which is what you should feel. But it takes practice. There's also a progressive muscle relaxation where we get individuals to squeeze their hands and then to relax, sometimes to stretch out these muscles. It's similar to yoga if you've done yoga. Yoga is basically a type of relaxation, and oftentimes therapists are recommending these kind of progressive muscle relaxation. But when we're combining the mental piece, then you're really moving from simply medical relaxation, physical relaxation, to mental. And this would involve, for psychotherapy and for behavioral therapy, we would begin with a fear hierarchy. On a scale of 1 to 10, what would give you the greatest sense of fear? Right? What would give you the least? And so we number this, and then we just start systematically, let's start by doing something that would bring you to a fear level of 1 or 2. And then we try to bring that 1 or 2 down to 0, and then bring you up to 4 or 5, and then bring you down to 1 or 2, right? So we're constantly trying to walk up the steps of our fear and then bring the fear level down to desensitize a person to whatever it is they're scared of. And so this would be a progressive exposure. Now, the military is using virtual exposure therapy. If you're taking notes, I want you to write that down. Virtual exposure therapy is a very efficient way to expose people to their feared stimuli, because we can do it now in a controlled environment. And it's really showing a lot of success in the military for people that have had traumatic experiences that have caused them to struggle. Now, aversion therapies are controversial and kind of radical in the sense that we're taking the person, putting them right in the midst of their most feared stimuli. And sometimes it's used for things that they're not scared of, but things that they are trying to break, habits they're trying to break. If you've ever had the experience of going into a restaurant where you enjoyed the food and you sit down and eat the food like normal, but then you find yourself becoming sick. And after the sickness, you realize that you've lost your appetite for that food. This is called taste aversion. And our brains use taste aversion to protect us. It's really sort of designed, if we're living in a forest and we eat a plant and we almost die, it's kind of our brain is helping us remember not to eat that plant. Well, your brain does these kind of things to help us. And so behavioral psychologists have used aversion therapy to help people quit smoking. So here you have a device. This is smoke aversion therapy, where they have 2 cigarettes here, and it's just rapid ingestion of nicotine to make a person feel so sick that they do not want to have another cigarette. And this is a type of aversion therapy, which is an undesirable behavior is paired with aversive stimulus. Another behavioral treatment is where flooding, for people with phobias or stress disorder, they give the person intense, inescapable exposure to the feared situation or object in hopes that they'll sort of break through their fear and realize that they're okay. Another action therapy would be modeling. For instance, I've worked with adolescents in an at-risk youth program where we simply bring them in contact with people who have done well in the program. Perhaps the program directors would bring in someone who's done very well, and that way they can see how graduation of a program is bringing someone success. And we can bring in, if we, for instance, were to teach social skills, and we bring in someone who has developed social skills and is now working, then we could use them as a model. Modeling is most commonly used, and I've used it the most with role play. We can model effective behavior, model effective communication, and assertive communication, and those kind of things we've done quite a lot. Okay, so in looking for participant modeling, here the model takes a client through a step-by-step process for the desired behavior. So this could be used a role play or someone that the client would identify with, and we're simply just taking them through this step-by-step process for the desired behavior. Now, positive and negative reinforcement are oftentimes confused, but positive reinforcement is when we are giving something that's desired, that's something that the client values for desired positive behavior. Negative reinforcement is when we are removing something negative in order to increase desired behavior. A token economy would be an example of positive reinforcement. So if we were to put someone in a position where, let's say it's an at-risk youth facility, and we want to reinforce the use of please and thank you. So we develop a system where the residents would get rewards. If they say please and thank you, they get credits that they can then exchange for video games and playing basketball, something of that nature. A contingency contract is a type of negative reinforcement. We're using negative reinforcement, which means we're removing something that's unpleasant in order to increase desired behavior. So let's say we have someone who's professional and they come into treatment because they're cursing too much at work. I'm just using this as an example. It's caused them problems because they begin to cuss their boss, etc. They have received several warnings, so they have come to the therapist to just sort of try to help this behavior. So let's say that the therapist puts them on a contingency contract. And so for every day that they go through and don't use this kind of obscene language and don't have an angry outburst, what they can do is simply put $1 into a jar, and the therapist matches this. Right? So they're doubling this, and at the end of 30 days, if the person has not had any angry outbursts and no cussing, then they will get to use this and give this money to a charity. However, if at any point they do not use this, at any point this person begins to have an angry outburst, then he will have to use this money to a cause that he is against. So let's say he is a Republican, and at the end of this 30 days, if he breaks this and begins to use foul language and anger outburst, well, then he has to give this to the Democratic Party. So that's the contingency contract. There is sort of a reward as well as a punishment if you don't follow through. May not be the best example, but I've used it a couple times in the past, and we'll see. Hopefully it doesn't give you any kind of confusion. Ask me if you have any questions. But extinction, an example of this would be timeout. Timeout is a removal from the situation that reinforces undesirable behavior. Timeout at the most basic level is used quite a lot by teachers, even if they don't know it. If you have a student who's acting out because they're sitting next to a friend that laughs at them and they're getting that positive attention, simply separating these kids may remove that undesirable behavior because what is reinforcing that behavior has been removed. So timeout happens a lot more than we might realize, but a formal timeout is simply whatever is reinforcing the child has been removed. Behavioral therapies are used a lot. They can be very effective, but they may not be effective in dealing with the root cause of the issue. They're simply treating symptoms, which in some cases this is very effective. There was a movement within the behavioral school to start accepting the idea of thoughts, that thoughts can be important and necessary to measure. Specifically, I would say there was a blend between cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology, and developed into cognitive therapy, and eventually cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive therapy is focusing on helping people change their ways of thinking. A cognitive therapist focuses on distorted thoughts and unrealistic beliefs that lead to maladaptive behavior. So if you think about these, and if we're honest, we all have had unrealistic distortions of thought, all right? Distorted thinking, irrational thoughts. Arbitrary inference is one where we jump to conclusions. We assume that someone will not like us without any evidence to this. After we know a person, we may say that because of one aspect of the situation that happens, we may draw conclusions about ourselves. If, for instance, we make a joke that no one laughs at, then we may say that we're not funny at all. It could be that no one heard the joke. We might overgeneralize, make sweeping conclusions based only on one incident. Take an incident that's happened and really jumping to conclusions. This is oftentimes with self-statements, right? We may magnify negative events and blow them out of proportion and ignore but the positive. And then finally, personalization. We may assume too much responsibility. We may take blame for things that we really shouldn't. So all of these cognitive distortions will come up as we look at cognitive therapy. A cognitive behavioral therapy is learning to think more logically, more rationally. So 3 goals here: to relieve symptoms and solve problems, develop strategies for solving future problems, and help change irrational or distorted thinking. With individuals who suffer with bipolar disorder, researchers have found that psychopharmacology alone is not as effective. Psychotherapy alone is not as effective. But when we're combining appropriate, well-diagnosed medicine and psychotherapy, people benefit more. So that bipolar can be improved best when people are talking about the problems they're having and they are receiving medicine. Rational emotive behavioral therapy is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy that focuses on challenging irrational beliefs and restructuring them. It's founded by Albert Ellis. This can be very inexpensive and short-term, and it can be less effective for serious psychological disorders such as schizophrenia, where irrational thinking is part of the condition. It's not simply a high-functioning person who's just thinking irrationally about a certain issue in their life. So here you have sort of a chart of famous psychotherapists, key people within every school: psychodynamic, person-centered, Gestalt, behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral, and rational emotive. So group therapies are efficient, and family counseling would be a type of group therapy, but I don't think of them as the same. I don't typically think of family therapy as a group therapy, although it is by definition a group. Family therapy is usually something discussed on its own. So you have marriage and family therapist. That's a credential someone specializes in. A counseling psychologist could do family counseling, family therapy. And they also could do group therapy. We typically conceptualize group therapy as 6 to 12 people who usually do not have a relationship outside of this group counseling. Now, a self-help group, I also say, is not really group therapy, because at a self-help group like Alcoholics Anonymous or Compassionate Friends, Compassionate Friends is another type of support group like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. But here you have people coming together with similar problems, and they meet without a therapist. So someone is running the group, but it's someone who is a group member who's just kind of risen to the ranks, and they're running meetings. The advantages of group therapy is it's low cost, it's exposure to others with similar problems, but the greatest support and the greatest benefit is not really the therapist, it's actually the people. When you get support from people that you see as being like you, it can be very encouraging. This is called universality. Some negatives of group therapy is that one therapist may have difficulty reading the room, may have difficulty being aware. Severely disordered people, sometimes people with personality disorders, can be very, very manipulative by definition of their problem. So a person who is very manipulative may try to run the group, may try to run the group into the ground, or they may have just manipulative, devious motives. So overall, this is most useful for people who need the social support. And I would say, in terms of people not affording individual therapy, oftentimes my experience as a group therapist, I've conducted group therapies for people who are part of an intensive outpatient program. And whereas some of these also received individual therapy, these folks just received group therapy. But I think it's most useful when you have individuals who are really struggling and they have individual and group therapy. And it may be with the same therapist. Usually it's with different therapists. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This involves moving the eyes rapidly back and forth while thinking of a disturbing memory. This has been used with post-traumatic stress, and it has been controversial simply because it is a type of reprocessing or almost similar to flooding, in that we're intentionally going to try to bring up harmful or scary or disturbing memories. So again, it would be important in looking into this for use to make sure that you found someone who is very skilled and is experienced doing this. Now, we study the effects of therapy. Researchers have found that therapy is most effective when the therapeutic alliance is very strong. So the therapeutic alliance is the relationship that we have with the therapist. So when we see that certain therapies are better for certain problems, it's important that someone is choosing the right therapist for the right problem, someone who's well trained, but most importantly, that they treat someone, that they choose someone who is warm, caring, accepting, empathic, that is just with great empathy, is very respectful. And this relationship typically best predicts who will improve. People improve from therapy the most